Would you take a moment to pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts and minds together be acceptable to you. Amen. So this is one of those occurrences that happens only every 6 years or so, that we have Christmas Eve and the fourth Sunday in Advent happening at the same time. But if you've been with us through Advent, you know that our theme has been the dawn of grace, and that comes from that third verse of Silent Night that we sang as we lit the candles. The first week in Advent, Pastor Joe defined grace as what happens when love becomes more than a feeling. It becomes an action. We talked about the first week, John the Baptist, and pointing the way for others. And then the second week, he talked about Mary. And we heard about how we embody grace, how we can embody God's grace. And last week we celebrated grace that comes into fruition through that new building. Grace is God's love in action. And so now today we bear witness to the dawn of grace coming in the face of a child, the Christ child. Emmanuel, God with us. But we all know, don't we, that the face of grace is not only found in the Christ child, but in the actions that take place through the face of that child and through God's redeeming grace. A few weeks ago, as I was pondering the face of grace, I was actually home sick. So what you're now going to hear, I may chalk up to the fact that I was sick. But I had this head cold, and I had laryngitis, and I saw the face of grace as I pulled out some of our Christmas decorations. Now, some of you may recognize this Santa. Now, poor Santa seems to have a broken hip. His voice has gotten a little raspy. But for several people in our household, this has become the face of grace. Now, I have to let you know, it's not because it's Santa. It's because there was a woman named Grace in the first church that I served. And Gracie had the face of grace. She was one of those volunteers who was present every week, like so many of you are, to help out wherever needed in the office. But Gracie shared with me that the reason she did that was because she had suffered severe, debilitating depression on the sudden loss of her husband. And the suggestion was made by the senior pastor that maybe she should come and spend more time at church. Maybe she could help out in some way. So gradually, Gracie became a regular fixture in the office, especially on Fridays, putting the bulletins together, again, like many of you have done. Serving was for her Christ's healing light. I can still see her. She had severe osteoporosis in her back. She drove a little white car, and every Friday you could see Gracie pulling into the parking lot, driving very slowly and carefully, looking through the steering wheel. And everyone knew to get out of the way for Gracie. But she always, always, always had a smile on her face and a kind word for everyone she encountered. Even as her health failed, her spirits never darkened. Gracie and her husband had had no children. She'd married late in life. But when Christmas came around, she was like a child herself. As soon as Advent began, she started decorating her home from top to bottom. And it was that way, I think, until her passing. She always, always, always decorated everything. But one of the things that we saw at her house when we visited her was the Jingle Bell Rock Santa. And so the face of grace is embodied in our Jingle Bell Rock Santa. So yeah, I told you it was like a cold head. But Gracie became the light in the darkness for others who were experiencing dark days because she had experienced it herself. And when the call was put out for her to serve in God's name, she said, yes. The face of grace breaks through the darkness when God's grace becomes love in action. The face of grace calls us to say yes, even when things seem hopeless. As the prophet Isaiah said, the people who have lived in darkness have seen a great light. The darkness can overwhelm us if we let it. Pure darkness, the kind of darkness that we seldom see, can be so unsettling and so disorienting. When someone loses their vision, they need to use their other senses, and thank God we have so many senses to help us to reorient ourselves and to navigate darkness. I'm sure most of you have had the experience where you wake up in the middle of the night and you're kind of disoriented until just a little bit of light breaks through so you can adjust to your surroundings. Just a tiny bit of light can help calm our fears, can't it? That's what happens at dawn, and that's why I love this image of the dawn of grace. The dawn breaking through that darkness. What I've come to realize is that we need to know those dark days in order to understand the power of the light. Walking through darkness can either destroy us or make us stronger. It can fill us with hope. It can fill us with compassion, with love. And whether the darkness you experience is a deep depression like Gracie, or the darkness of food or financial insecurity, or the stress of life in general, we know life is stressful. The face of God's redeeming grace is the love that breaks through those barriers and tears down walls. Through the unholy darkness of our lives, God's grace breaks forth, just like the dawn of a new day. And God calls us to recognize and acknowledge the dark days in our life, the dark times, so that we then can proclaim God's grace. The story that we heard through Scripture this morning, as Nancy read, is a one that's so familiar to us. All those people coming together as unlikely players in this dawning of God's grace. And yet they're critical to the story. I believe that each one of us has free will, and just like each one of those players in the story, they had the opportunity and the ability to say no. They didn't have to say yes, but they did. They did. There was a partnership happening, however unwittingly, in this particular time and place that Luke tells us about. First named in Luke's account are the Emperor Augustus and Quirinius. They're not Jews. But why do we need to know their names? We need to know them because it places this whole story in a particular time of history. And Luke names them to give us that context. They anchor it. They anchor that story. But maybe even more importantly, they remind us that God's grace came through Gentiles. Even they said yes to God. Even if they didn't know they were doing it. They were just doing their jobs, weren't they? And yet through their political work, through that calling of the census, they said yes to God's grace. Next, Luke mentions Joseph. And in Luke's telling of the story, we don't hear much about Joseph. He appears to be someone simply fulfilling his role as a citizen. Good citizen going to be registered, taking his bride with him. There's no mention in this chapter of Mary's unexpected pregnancy like we hear in Matthew. But we're all aware, aren't we, as we read through these Gospels, as we've heard this story so many times, that the face of God's grace in Joseph's acceptance was so present. He could have chosen to do things very differently, and yet he didn't. He took responsibility when he didn't need to. He was honorable. He was righteous. He was the perfect earthly father for this baby that was going to face so much in his life. And he was the perfect father and husband for this family. Because here was Mary, the God-bearer, singled out to give life to this incarnate one, the Son of God and the Son of Man. We hear about how that all comes to be in the first chapter of Luke, but in this second chapter, the face of grace is on Mary as she travels. It's on Mary as she journeys in that 9th month of pregnancy, walking, possibly riding a donkey. Imagine how much grace that took, how much perseverance. And then Luke says, the time came for her to deliver. Oh, such a simple act, right? But here she was, giving birth gracefully in humble surroundings. Mary said yes, and so she wears the face of grace. How many of us, how many people through the generations have faced challenging situations and simply done what was required of us? We push through whatever the hardship is because there is no other way. And we know that God is with us on that journey through whatever it is. The face of God's grace is seen through Mary's acknowledgement of her situation. And then imagine her face of grace welcoming those visitors to those humble surroundings. We hear about the shepherds, a few more unlikely characters. I can't even imagine what it felt like for them. Simply out there in the fields doing their job, tending the sheep, maybe dozing off in the middle of the night. Have you ever been awakened in the middle of the night by a bright, flashing light? I'm sure some of you have. It's amazing. It's scary. It's kind of like the telephone ringing in the middle of the night. It's like, ah! What's that about? Surely someone has died when the telephone rings in the middle of the night. But no. This announcement from the angels was about a birth. An amazing and wonderful birth. Luke says there was a multitude of angels sharing the good news, and sure, the shepherds had to have been afraid. They were only human, weren't they? But they listened. Did they understand the message? We don't know much about shepherds, but would they have been educated enough to know what this message actually meant? I don't know. But they listened, and they went. They went with haste. They witnessed the face of God's grace in the innocence of a newborn baby. Did they know what they were witnessing? The birth of a baby is amazing, and yet they'd been told so much more about this particular child, and so they went and they told others. And Mary pondered these things. I suspect that she pondered those things over many, many years, not realizing maybe in that moment what the rest of her life and his life would be like. Each and every one of them said yes, even that baby. Even that baby said yes. The face of grace can be within and upon each one of us. In fact, God's grace is available to you now and in every moment. How strange is that God's grace is there? God's love is here for you, here for each one of us. I'm convinced that God is nudging us constantly to participate in God's redeeming grace, and yet most of us have our to-do lists, don't we? What about God's to-do list? On this day, above all others, I think we're called to remember God has a to-do list as well. All of these pieces come together in God's time. We call it kairos, or synchronicity is another way of thinking about it. They're divine coincidences. Divine coincidences that come to us when enough events happen, when enough people say yes. That's what was happening in that story that we heard. Kairos, God's time. The more attuned we become to the divine through prayer and through service, the more aware we are of those many, many coincidences that come our way. And then we become attuned to God's blessings as they're revealed to us. I'm sure that we've each had amazing blessings in our lives because of the way things have come together. Those kairos moments when God is working through others, through events, through unwitting characters like the emperor. We wait for those moments, we watch for those moments, and sometimes we don't even recognize those moments until much later after it happened. Maybe years. Maybe we don't even know what's happening in our lifetime. It might happen for the next, just as this story has unfolded for us, for each one of us, for each one of God's children through the years. We too can become the face of grace for others. We can help others to see the darkness that surrounds them. We can be God's redeeming grace. And all we need to do is say yes to God. It can be scary, but it can be wonderful. God's grace, God's amazing grace, can move as a powerful force through nature, moves love to this next level, and all we need to do is say yes. Amen.